I'm Major Brenda Owens, 34 years old, U.S. Air Force. I earned my commission at 23 on a ROTC scholarship and spent a decade coordinating air-ground missions in combat zones. For years, I backed my father financially, showed up for every event, and absorbed his sarcasm in silence, because that's what family was supposed to mean. But when he mocked my service in front of a room full of guests at my stepsister's wedding, and the Navy SEAL he was praising stood up and told him I'd once saved his life, I made a different choice. Have you ever been dismissed or humiliated by someone you gave everything to? If so, you're not alone. Tell me your story in the comments. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being undervalued, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and self-respect. What happened next might surprise you. I sat near the back of the reception hall, dress blues crisp against the white folding chair, watching my father work the room like he always did. Richard Owens had that gift, the kind of charisma that made strangers feel like old friends within minutes. He moved between tables with a wine glass in one hand and a story ready on his lips, his retired contractor swagger still intact at 63. The string lights overhead cast everything in that warm, forgiving glow that makes wedding receptions feel like they exist outside of real time. My stepsister Jessica looked beautiful up at the head table, her hand resting on her new husband's arm. Lieutenant Commander Drew Mason sat beside her with the kind of quiet presence I recognized immediately, not shy, just economical with his energy. Navy SEAL. You could tell from the way he tracked the room without seeming to, the way he held himself like he was ready to move in any direction at any moment. He was probably 36, maybe 37, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent serious time in the sun and the dark both. I'd been back stateside for 3 months after my rotation in Helmand Province. Captain Brenda Owens, 03, United States Air Force. I coordinated air-ground operations, which sounds cleaner than it actually was. Most people heard Air Force and pictured desk work, air conditioning, relative safety. They weren't entirely wrong about the first two. The third part was more complicated. My father caught my eye from across the room and raised his glass with that familiar grin. I raised mine back, a practiced smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. We'd perfected this dance over the years, him performing, me supporting from a distance. He'd never quite forgiven me for choosing the military over the corporate path he'd mapped out. ROTC scholarship at 20, commissioned at 23, and now at 33 I wore the captain's bars he still introduced with a hint of amusement, like my career was a phase I'd eventually outgrow. Ladies and gentlemen, the MC's voice cut through the ambient chatter. The father of the bride would like to say a few words. My father took the microphone with the ease of someone who'd given 1,000 toasts. The room settled into attentive silence. He started with Jessica, painting a picture of her childhood with the kind of selective memory that made everyone laugh in the right places. Then he moved to Drew, welcoming him to the family with genuine warmth. They'd bonded quickly, my father and his new son-in-law. Two men who understood each other's language of accomplishment and action. Now I have to acknowledge my other daughter, he said, turning toward my table. The spotlight found me before I was ready. Captain Brenda Owens, serving bravely in the United States Air Force. The room offered polite applause. I nodded, trying to disappear back into my chair. Brenda's stationed at some of the finest facilities the military has to offer, he continued, his tone walking that edge between affection and mockery. I keep telling her, the Air Force really knows how to take care of their people. 5-star hotels, from what I understand. Scattered laughter. I kept my expression neutral, fingers wrapped around the stem of my water glass. This was familiar territory. My father's humor had always carried teeth, and over the years I'd learned to let the jokes land without flinching. The alternative, correcting him, defending myself, only ever made things worse. But then his voice shifted, just slightly. The playful edge sharpened into something else. You know, we're living in a time where everyone wants to be a victim, he said, still smiling but with his eyes hardening at the corners. PTSD this, PTSD that. Brenda here, she's just another vet looking for pity from what I can tell. The laughter died. Not all at once, it faded in confused patches, people uncertain if they'd heard correctly or if this was still part of the act. I felt my spine straighten involuntarily, muscle memory from years of standing at attention. My face remained perfectly still. I'd learned that in uniform, had perfected it during mission briefs, when everything was going wrong and you couldn't let the ground team hear the fear in your voice. The microphone feedback whined softly in the silence. My father seemed to realize he'd crossed a line, but his pride wouldn't let him backtrack. He opened his mouth to continue. "Sir." The word cut through the room like a knife. Drew had stood up from the head table, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made people turn. His voice was steady, controlled, but something in it made the whole room focus on him immediately. Command presence. The real kind, not the performed version. "Sir," he repeated, his eyes locked on my father. "That's not accurate." My father blinked, the microphone still in his hand. "Drew, this woman saved my life in Hellmand." The words landed like ordnance. Complete silence followed them. My father's hand went slack and the microphone slipped from his fingers, hitting the carpeted floor with a muffled thud. The feedback screamed for a moment before someone killed the sound system. Drew's gaze shifted from my father to me. I watched recognition move across his face in real time, his eyes narrowing, memory clicking into place. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but somehow it carried further. "Falcon 3. My call sign. The one I'd used on approximately 200 missions, the one that followed me through every radio check and situation report. I hadn't heard it spoken aloud in months, and hearing it now, in this context, felt like being pulled underwater. I met Drew's eyes. He knew. Somehow, without ever having seen my face, he knew exactly who I was. 0230 hours, he said, still looking at me. June 14th. My team was pinned down half a click from the extraction point. We had 2 critical casualties and no air support within range. You were managing 3 separate medevac requests and a close air support package all at once. I remembered. God, I remembered. The chaos in my headset, 3 different ground commanders screaming for help, the aircraft all running on fumes, the weather turning. Drew's voice had been the calmest of all of them, even with his leg torn open and his second-in-command bleeding out 6 feet away. "You prioritized the other casualties first," Drew continued. His voice held no accusation, only statement of fact. "Sent the birds to the Army patrol because they were in worse shape. Told me to hold position for 16 minutes. 16 minutes with Taliban fighters closing our perimeter." The room was frozen. Jessica had her hand over her mouth. My father stood beside the head table looking like someone had physically struck him. When that pavehawk finally came over the ridge, Drew said, "Your voice was the last thing I heard before I passed out. Package inbound, 30 seconds, mark your position with IR. You guided them in through a dust storm with 0 visibility. Everyone on my team went home because of you." He straightened slightly, and even in his wedding suit he looked like he was standing at attention. "So with respect, sir," he said, turning back to my father, "your daughter isn't looking for pity. She's the reason 6 Navy SEALs are alive." The drive home took 40 minutes, but I barely registered the road. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, muscle memory again, the same way they'd stayed steady on the radio controls while Drew's team fought for their lives 12 time zones away. The wedding reception had dissolved after Drew's revelation. People didn't know where to look. My father had attempted some kind of recovery, but the microphone stayed dead and his voice never quite found its footing again. Jessica had caught me before I left, her eyes brimming with tears I didn't know how to handle. "Brenda, I had no idea. Drew never talks about deployment. I didn't know it was you." I'd hugged her because that's what you do at weddings, told her congratulations again, and excused myself before the questions could start. Before my father could corner me with whatever combination of apology and justification he was preparing. My apartment felt exactly as I'd left it 4 hours earlier, clean, minimal, a place where I slept and stored my uniforms, but didn't quite live. I hung up my dress blues with the same precision I'd learned at officer training school 12 years ago. Every ribbon in its proper place, every crease aligned. The Bronze Star with Valor device sat third from the top, right below my Air Force Commendation Medal. I'd received it 9 months ago in a brief ceremony at Bagram. My father hadn't asked about it. When I'd mentioned the award during a phone call, he'd said, "That's great, honey," in the same tone he used when I told him I'd gotten my oil changed. I sat on the edge of my bed, still in my slip, and let myself remember Hellman. Not the sanitized version I carried for small talk, but the real thing. The weight of the headset pressing against my skull for 16-hour shifts. The taste of dust that no amount of water could wash away. The controlled chaos of managing assets across a theater where every grid coordinate represented someone's son or daughter fighting for their life. I'd been 23 when I commissioned as a second lieutenant, fresh out of ROTC and certain I was going to change the world. My father had skipped the ceremony. Business trip to Houston, non-negotiable client meeting. My mother had come, divorced from him by then, and she'd pinned on my butter bars with hands that shook slightly. She died of cancer 2 years later, never having seen me make first lieutenant. By 26, I wore the railroad tracks of a captain. By 29, I was running air operations in one of the most dangerous provinces in Afghanistan. The promotion board had noted my exceptional performance under combat conditions and uncommonly mature judgment. What they meant was that I could keep my voice level while watching helmet camera footage of Americans dying and making the call about which ones we could save and which ones were already gone. The day I saved Drew's team, I'd been awake for 19 hours. We'd started the shift with 3 medevac helicopters. One had gone down to mechanical failure around 0800 hours. The second was on a run to Kandahar with a Marine who'd lost both legs. That left one bird to cover approximately 8,000 square kilometers of active combat operations. When Drew's call came in, I'd already denied 2 lower priority requests. A soldier with a gunshot wound to the shoulder who could hold position. An Afghan interpreter with shrapnel wounds who was conscious and talking. Both survivable if they waited. Both desperately needed help. Then I heard Drew's voice, clipped and professional even through the sound of gunfire. "Falcon 3. This is Viper 6. 2 urgent surgical, 1 routine. We're combat ineffective and taking fire from 3 positions. Combat ineffective. Military speak for, we can't fight anymore, we can't move, and we're going to die here if you don't help us." I'd had to make the call. The Army patrol with the spinal injury went first, completely paralyzed soldier being dragged through a kill zone by his squad. Then an Air Force combat controller who'd been hit in the chest and was drowning in his own blood. Both missions took the helicopter beyond its scheduled return time, pushed it past safety margins on fuel. Drew's team waited. 16 minutes that must have felt like hours while I coordinated the bird's approach, cleared a route through the air corridor, got close air support to suppress the Taliban positions just long enough for the extraction. 16 minutes, I said aloud to my empty apartment. 16 minutes during which Lieutenant Commander Drew Mason had held pressure on his medic's arterial bleed with one hand while returning fire with the other, his own femur fractured and his blood pressure dropping. He'd said Roger when I told him he'd have to wait. Not argued, not pleaded, just Roger and then radio silence except for position updates. That's how I knew he was good at his job. The ones who were good at their jobs trusted that everyone else was good at theirs. I'd gotten him out. Gotten all of them out. The Pavehawk had landed in a brownout dust storm so thick the pilots were flying on instruments and my voice alone, trusting the grid coordinates I fed them were accurate within meters. The crew chief had told me later that they'd found Drew unconscious in the bird, his hand still locked around his medic's wrist, applying pressure even after he'd passed out from blood loss. My father had called me 3 times during that deployment. Once to ask if I could help his buddy's son get into the Air Force Academy, I couldn't. Once to tell me about a business deal that had gone south, I'd listened politely. Once to inform me he was dating Jessica's mother, and would I please be nice about it, I had been. He'd never asked what I did during those long stretches of silence. Never asked why I sometimes didn't return his emails for weeks. When I came home after that rotation, thin and hollow-eyed and carrying something in my chest that felt like broken glass, he'd taken me to dinner and spent 2 hours talking about his new consulting contracts. "At least you're done pretending to be a hero," he'd said over dessert, smiling like it was a joke we both understood. I'd smiled back and said nothing. Now I pulled my phone from my purse and scrolled through the messages. 7 from my father, starting apologetic and escalating to defensive. You know how I joke, Bren. I didn't mean anything by it. You're being too sensitive about this. Call me when you're ready to be reasonable. I deleted them all without responding. Then I opened my banking app and canceled the automatic monthly transfer I'd been sending him for 3 years. $1,500 every month to help cover the mortgage after his business had struggled. Money he'd never acknowledged, never thanked me for, just accepted as his due. The confirmation screen asked if I was sure. I selected yes. Outside my window, the city lights blurred into constellations of amber and white. Somewhere in this same city, Drew was probably processing the same evening from his own angle. Jessica was probably crying, confused about how her perfect wedding had fractured along fault lines she didn't know existed. And my father was probably still trying to figure out how to spin the narrative back in his favor. I turned off my phone and lay back on the bed, still in my slip, and let the silence settle over me like a blanket. Tomorrow I'd go back to work. Tomorrow I'd be Captain Owens again, the job that had never asked me to be anything other than competent and present. Tonight, I was just someone who'd finally stopped waiting for her father's approval. I joined ROTC my sophomore year of college because I needed the scholarship money and because something in me responded to the structure. My father had laughed when I told him, actually laughed, and said, Brenda, you realize they're going to make you run everywhere, right? Like physical fitness was something ridiculous, something beneath the daughter of a man who'd built his own consulting firm from nothing. But I'd learned to run, learned to lead. At 23, I raised my right hand and swore to support and defend the Constitution, and my father sent a card that said, "Congratulations on your commission," with his signature and nothing else. No phone call, no visit, just his name in black ink at the bottom of a Hallmark card. Second Lieutenant Owens reported to Randolph Air Force Base for training and discovered she was good at this. Not just competent, good. The kind of good that made instructors take notice. By 25, I was a first lieutenant running training exercises that prepared pilots for combat scenarios they'd encounter downrange. By 27, I wore captain's bars and was managing actual combat operations from a forward operating base in Afghanistan. My father's reaction to each promotion was roughly the same. That's great, honey. When do you think you'll be done with all this? Like military service was a hobby. Like defending my country was something I'd eventually grow out of and replace with a real career, preferably something he could brag about at dinner parties. The first time I coordinated a medevac under fire, I was 28 years old and terrified I was going to get someone killed through my incompetence. An Army patrol had hit an IED. 3 casualties, 1 critical. The helicopter pilot was flying through ground fire and asking me questions I didn't know if I was answering correctly. My hands shook so badly I had to squeeze the radio controls to keep my voice steady. Everyone lived. The pilot told me afterward that my voice had been the calmest thing in his headset, and I'd gone back to my quarters and vomited from the adrenaline crash. By the time I saved Drew's team, I'd coordinated over 200 combat missions. The shaking had stopped. The calm voice wasn't an act anymore, it was just who I became when lives were on the line. You adapted or you failed, and failure meant body bags, so you adapted. Helmand Province in June was hell with sand in it. Temperatures hit 115 degrees by mid-morning and stayed there. The Taliban controlled enough territory that every movement outside the wire was contested. Our operating base sat in a valley surrounded by high ground, which was exactly as tactically stupid as it sounds, but we worked with what we had. I ran the night shift because that's when most of the fighting happened. 2,000 hours to 0800 hours, managing everything that flew in our sector. Medevac requests, close air support, supply runs, ISR platforms tracking high-value targets. The radios never stopped. The moment one crisis resolved, another one emerged. June 14th started like any other night. 3 ongoing operations, moderate contact, nothing we couldn't handle. Then around 0200 hours, everything went wrong simultaneously. First call, Army patrol hit by complex ambush. 1 soldier with suspected spinal injury being dragged through a kill zone. Urgent surgical, which meant he had maybe an hour before he died or ended up paralyzed forever. Second call, Air Force combat controller hit in the chest. Sucking chest wound, drowning in his own blood. Maybe 30 minutes if they were lucky. Third call, Navy SEAL team, 2 critical casualties, pinned down and combat ineffective. I had 1 helicopter. The math was brutal and simple. Everybody needed help immediately. Only 1 could get it first. The other 2 would wait or die waiting. My commander, Colonel Elizabeth Monroe, was standing behind me. She didn't say anything, just put her hand on my shoulder briefly, the kind of touch that meant I had the authority to make the call, and she'd back whatever I decided. I sent the bird to the spinal injury first. Paralysis was permanent if we didn't move fast. Then to the combat controller, because chest wounds killed quickly. I told Drew's team, Viper 6, I didn't know his name then, that they were third in line. His response was immediate. Roger, Falcon 3. We'll hold. No argument. No bargaining. Just acknowledgement and trust. While the helicopter made those first 2 runs, I coordinated close air support to suppress the Taliban positions around Drew's team. F-16s out of Bagram put ordnance close enough that I could hear the explosions through Drew's radio. Not danger close, but close enough to buy time. Then I worked the helicopter crew, pushed them on fuel margins, got them to agree to 1 more mission before they'd have to return to base. Viper 6, Falcon 3. Package inbound, ETA 16 minutes. Roger, Falcon 3. Drew's voice was tight now, pain breaking through the professional calm. We'll be here. 16 minutes. The longest 16 minutes of my career, and probably the longest of his life. The helicopter pilot, a warrant officer named Chin, didn't want to make the approach. The weather had shifted. Dust storm rolling in, visibility dropping to nothing. Flying in those conditions was how helicopters ended up in mountains or shot down because they couldn't see the ground fire until it hit them. Chin, I need you to trust me, I said. I will guide you in. I've got eyes on satellite ISR. I can see what you can't. Falcon 3, if we go down, you're not going down. I've got you. I didn't know if I had him. The satellite feed was grainy, the dust storm was degrading it by the minute, and I was asking a pilot to fly blind into a combat zone based on my grid coordinates and my voice. He went anyway. I watched the feed, watched the helicopter appear as a digital ghost moving across my screen. Called out obstacles, ridgeline at 2 o'clock, Wadi at 10 o'clock, friendly positions marked with IR strobes. Drew's team had laid out the landing zone with chemical lights that showed up on the ISR as bright spots in the darkness. Viper 6, Falcon 3. 30 seconds. Mark your position with IR. Drew's response was barely audible over the rotor wash. Position marked. The helicopter descended into the dust cloud and disappeared from my visual. Chin was flying on instruments and my voice now. 15 seconds. 10 seconds. 5. Bird away, Chin reported, which meant they'd loaded the casualties and were lifting off. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until my lungs started burning. Falcon 3, Viper 6, Drew said. His voice was fading. Good work. Then nothing. They'd gotten him sedated, probably, or he'd passed out. The helicopter climbed out of the dust and turned toward the nearest trauma center. I watched the digital icon move across my screen until it left my sector. Then I logged the mission and moved to the next crisis. That was 22 months ago. I'd been home for 3 months, out-processed from that deployment, and I'd never met any of the people I saved. Never saw their faces. They were call signs and grid coordinates and voices in my headset, and that was how it was supposed to work. Until my father mocked me at a wedding reception, and the groom turned out to be one of those voices. Drew had recognized me not by my face, but by my presence. Whatever he'd heard in my voice that night in Helmand, he'd heard it again in that reception hall. The same calm, the same certainty, the same woman who'd told him to hold position for 16 minutes while she saved 2 other teams first. I lay in my apartment remembering all of it, the heat, the dust, the fear, the weight of knowing that my decisions would save some lives and cost others. Remembering my father's words, "At least you're done pretending to be a hero." I'd never pretended anything. I'd just done my job. The job he'd never bothered to understand. 3 days passed before my father called again. I was at work when my phone buzzed, so I declined the call and went back to reviewing training assessments for the next class of junior officers. My new assignment was instructor duty at Maxwell Air Force Base, teaching leadership principles to lieutenants who still thought war was going to be like the movies. Most of them were 23, 24 years old. Same age I'd been when I commissioned. I looked at them and saw myself, eager, terrified, convinced that confidence was the same thing as competence. My job was to teach them the difference before they got someone killed. Lieutenant Sarah Nguyen stopped by my office around 1500 hours. She was 25, Vietnamese American, whip-smart, and desperately insecure about it. Reminded me of myself in ways that were sometimes painful to watch. "Captain Owens? Do you have a minute?" I waved her in. She sat across from my desk, holding a training manual like it was a shield. "I'm struggling with the air-ground coordination module," she said. "I keep freezing during the simulations. Everyone's talking at once, and I can't prioritize." I'd written half the curriculum for that module based on my time in Helmand. The simulations were deliberately chaotic, multiple casualties, limited assets, impossible decisions. The point wasn't to teach them the right answer. The point was to teach them that there often wasn't one. "Walk me through your last simulation," I said. She did. 3 casualty scenarios, 1 helicopter, and she'd spent so long trying to figure out the optimal solution that she'd let time run out. Everyone died while she was thinking. "What's your actual question, Lieutenant?" She hesitated. "How do you know you're making the right choice?" "You don't." That surprised her. She'd been expecting some wisdom, some formula. You gather the information you have, you make the best decision you can with what you know, and you live with the consequences. Sometimes people die anyway. Sometimes you save someone and later you find out they went home and murdered their wife. There's no optimal solution. There's just what you decide in the moment and then everything that happens after. "That's terrifying," she said. "Yes." She left looking thoughtful instead of defeated, which was progress. I watched her go and thought about all the lieutenants I'd trained, all the voices I'd guided through chaos. How many of them were out there right now, wearing captain's bars or major's oak leaves, making impossible decisions because I'd taught them how? My father called again that evening. I was running at the time, trying to burn off the restlessness that had been following me since the wedding. 6 miles at a 7:30 pace, the rhythm of my feet hitting pavement the closest thing I had to meditation. I stopped at a park bench to check my phone. Missed call from Richard Owens. No voicemail. Just the call itself, which was its own kind of message. He wanted me to call back. Wanted to be pursued. I put my phone away and finished my run. On Friday, Jessica texted, "Can we talk?" "Please." We met for coffee on Saturday morning. She looked tired, her wedding glow already faded into the stress of whatever was happening at home. Drew had deployed again, she told me. Short notice, somewhere she couldn't ask about. She was alone in their new apartment, trying to figure out how to be a military spouse. "I'm sorry about Dad," she said finally. What he said at the reception. I didn't know any of it. He didn't know either, I said. That's the problem. Drew wanted me to give you his email. He said if you ever want to talk about Helmand or anything, he owes you that. She slid a piece of paper across the table. I took it but didn't look at it. "How is Dad handling everything?" I asked. Jessica's expression shifted into something complicated. "He's upset. Embarrassed, I think. He keeps saying everyone's overreacting, that it was just a joke." That sounded right. My father never apologized cleanly. He apologized in layers, first defensive, then minimizing, then eventually offering something that sounded like remorse, but always had an excuse attached to it. "Have you talked to him?" Jessica asked. "No. Are you going to?" I stirred my coffee, watching the cream spiral into patterns. "I don't know yet." The truth was more complicated. I'd spent 3 decades trying to earn my father's respect. Trying to make him see me as something other than a daughter who disappointed him by choosing service over profit. Every promotion, every award, every mission had been offered up like proof. See what I can do? Am I enough now? And he'd never seen it. Never asked. Never cared to understand that the woman in the Air Force uniform was doing something that mattered, something that saved lives, something worth respecting. It had taken Drew's public declaration to make him realize there might be more to my career than hotel rooms and desk work. But that realization hadn't come from any internal recognition of my worth. It had come from embarrassment. From being called out in front of a room full of guests. From having a Navy SEAL tell him he was wrong. He was sorry he'd been embarrassed. I wasn't sure he was sorry he'd been wrong. He asked me to talk to you, Jessica said quietly. He wants to make things right. Then he can call me himself. Not send you as an intermediary. She nodded, looking miserable. This wasn't her fault. She was 29 years old and caught between her new husband and her father, trying to smooth over tensions she hadn't created. I'm not angry with you, I told her. This has nothing to do with you and Drew. Okay. We finished our coffee talking about safer things, her new job, the apartment she and Drew were fixing up, whether she wanted to get a dog. Normal sister conversation, the kind we'd never quite managed when we were younger. Our parents' marriage had been brief and bitter, the divorce finalizing when I was 19 and she was 15. We'd been thrust into each other's lives and then separated before we could figure out how to be siblings. Maybe there was something salvageable there. Maybe we could build something real without our father's dysfunction coloring every interaction. When I got home, I opened my laptop and stared at Drew's email address. He'd written it himself in neat block letters, lcdr.mason@navy.mil. I started typing twice and deleted it both times. What did you say to someone who'd saved your career by defending you? Who'd given you something you'd been chasing your whole life, validation from your father, except it felt hollow now because it had required a witness. Finally, I wrote, Lieutenant Commander Mason, thank you for your honesty at the reception. I'm glad you and your team made it home. Respectfully, Captain Brenda Owens. Professional. Clean. Nothing that required a response. He replied within an hour, Captain, the honor was mine. If you're ever near Virginia Beach, first beer's on me. The whole case, actually. Fair winds, Drew. I smiled despite myself. Then I closed my laptop and went back to the training assessments waiting on my desk. My father called again on Sunday. This time I answered. Brenda. His voice was careful. Thank you for picking up. What do you want, Dad? A pause. He wasn't used to me being direct. I'd always been the peacemaker, the one who smoothed things over and accepted his non-apologies with grace. I want to talk about what happened, he said. I think we should have dinner. Clear the air. I don't think that's necessary. Brenda, I'm your father, and I'm your daughter, who you've spent my entire adult life dismissing. So no, I don't think dinner is necessary. I think we're exactly where we've always been. You just had to hear it from someone else first. I hung up before he could respond. My hands weren't shaking. My voice had been steady. I felt nothing except a strange, clean absence where obligation used to live. The promotion board met in August. I'd submitted my package for Major 6 months earlier, back when I was still in Afghanistan and running on 4 hours of sleep and cold coffee. The Air Force promoted you on a combination of time in service, performance evaluations, and how badly they needed your particular skill set. I'd checked all the boxes. 28 months as a captain, top-tier evaluations from 3 different commanders, combat deployments, and a Bronze Star that suggested I was good under pressure. Still, you never knew until the results came through. The Air Force could decide you were valuable where you were and keep you there indefinitely. Or they could decide you were exactly what they needed in the next tier of leadership. Colonel Monroe called me into her office on a Tuesday afternoon. She was 51 years old, had been flying jets back when the Air Force still wasn't sure what to do with women in combat roles, and had exactly 0 patience for politics or inefficiency. Congratulations, Major Owens, she said, handing me the official letter. Oh, 4. Field Grade Officer. The rank where you stopped being a junior officer learning the ropes and became someone responsible for shaping policy and developing the next generation. Most people made major around 33, 34 years old. I'd just turned 34 last month. Thank you, ma'am. You earned it. She studied me for a moment. How are you doing? Monroe knew about the wedding reception. Not because I'd told her, but because Drew had sent a letter to my chain of command describing what happened in Helmand and requesting it be added to my service record. Professional courtesy from one officer to another, making sure my actions were properly documented. I'm fine, ma'am. Your father. Not relevant to my career, ma'am. She nodded slowly. Monroe had 3 daughters and an ex-husband who couldn't handle being married to a woman who outranked him. She understood complicated family dynamics. The board liked your training curriculum, she said. They want you to expand it. Develop a comprehensive air-ground coordination program for Maxwell. You'd be building something from scratch that'll shape how we prepare junior officers for the next decade. It was exactly the kind of assignment that made careers. High visibility, high impact, working directly with senior leadership. The kind of thing that positioned you for lieutenant colonel and eventually colonel if you played it right. I'm honored, ma'am. Don't be honored. Just do the work. I left her office with the promotion letter in my hand and a new assignment that meant I'd be staying at Maxwell for at least 3 more years. Stability. Purpose. A chance to pour everything I'd learned in Hellmand into making sure the next generation didn't have to learn it the same hard way. My father found out about the promotion through Jessica. She texted me that evening. Dad says congratulations on Major. He didn't call. Didn't text. Just sent word through my stepsister like we were feudal families communicating through envoys. I didn't respond. Lieutenant Gwynn bought me coffee a week later to congratulate me. She'd heard through the informal network that I was being promoted and that I'd be staying on as an instructor. I'm glad you're not leaving, she said. You're the only instructor who doesn't treat us like we're stupid for being nervous. Being nervous is fine. Being paralyzed by nerves gets people killed. She smiled. See? That's what I mean. Everyone else just tells us to be confident. You tell us the truth. The truth was harder than confidence. Confidence was something you performed. Truth was something you earned through failure and repetition until it became automatic. Until you could keep your voice level while watching people die and making decisions that would haunt you forever. I didn't say that. She'd figure it out on her own eventually. September brought new students and new responsibilities. As a major, I didn't just teach anymore. I designed curriculum, evaluated instructor performance, and sat in meetings where senior officers debated training philosophy like it was theology. The Air Force loved meetings. Loved acronyms and metrics and PowerPoint presentations that turned simple concepts into 40-slide decision matrices. I was good at it despite hating it. Could synthesize complex operational requirements into training objectives that actually prepared people for combat instead of just checking boxes. Colonel Monroe called me her bullshit translator, which I took as a compliment. My father called twice in September. I didn't answer either time. He left voicemails that progressed from conciliatory to frustrated. The first one, Brenda, I know you're upset, but we should talk. I'm your father. Call me. The second one, I don't understand why you're being so stubborn about this. I apologized to Jessica. What more do you want? What I wanted was for him to understand why his apology to Jessica wasn't an apology to me. But explaining that would require him to acknowledge that he'd spent decades diminishing my service, and I was tired of teaching people things they should already know. Drew came home from deployment in October. Jessica threw a small welcome-back party, and she invited me. I almost declined, but something made me go. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the fact that Drew had defended me when my own father wouldn't. The party was casual, maybe 15 people in their small apartment, mostly other military couples and a few of Jessica's work friends. I arrived late, still in my uniform because I'd come straight from base. The new rank insignia felt strange on my shoulders, heavier somehow even though the physical weight was identical. Drew saw me first. He was across the room talking to another SEAL, but his eyes tracked to the door the moment I walked in. Military instinct, always know who's entering your space. He excused himself and came over. Major Owens. He offered his hand. Congratulations on the promotion. Thank you, Commander. Welcome home. We shook hands like professional colleagues, which is what we were. But there was something else underneath it, shared experience that couldn't quite fit into formal military courtesy. He'd heard me at my best, guiding him through chaos when he was bleeding out. I'd heard him at his worst, trying to stay conscious long enough to keep his team alive. Can I get you a drink? He asked. Just water. I'm driving. He brought me a bottle of water, and we stood near the kitchen, slightly apart from the main party. Jessica was watching us from across the room with an expression I couldn't quite read. Relief, maybe? Or hope that whatever fracture had opened at the wedding might somehow heal. I wanted to thank you, Drew said quietly, for not making a big deal about the wedding. You could have. You had every right to. It wasn't about me. It became about you the moment your father decided to use his speech as a roast. Drew's jaw tightened slightly. I'm sorry that happened. I'm not sorry I said what I said. Don't be. It was the truth. Yeah. He took a drink of his beer. Your father reached out to me actually. Asked me to talk to you on his behalf. I wasn't surprised. My father had always been good at finding intermediaries. What did you tell him? That I don't work for him, and he should handle his own family relationships. Drew smiled without humor. He didn't love that. I imagine not. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Party noise filled the space around us, laughter, music, the overlapping conversations of people who felt safe enough to relax. Military families celebrating the fact that everyone had made it home this time. Tomorrow someone else would deploy, someone else would wait by the phone, someone else would wonder if this would be the mission that didn't end well. But tonight everyone was home. For what it's worth, Drew said, I think what you're doing now matters as much as what you did in Helmand. Maybe more. Training the next generation to not make the mistakes we made, that's how we actually get better at this. It was the most thoughtful thing anyone had said to me about my new assignment. Most people treated instructor duty as a break from real work. A chance to coast before your next deployment. Drew understood it was something else. Thank you, I said. And meant it. Jessica appeared beside us, sliding her arm around Drew's waist. You two look way too serious for a party. Come eat something. We have entirely too much food. The rest of the evening passed easily. I talked to other guests, heard deployment stories I couldn't share with civilians, laughed at jokes that only made sense if you'd been there. This was the military community I'd chosen, people who understood what service cost, who didn't need explanations or justifications. I left around 2200 hours. Drew and Jessica walked me to the door. I'm glad you came, Jessica said, hugging me. Maybe we could do coffee again soon? Just us. I'd like that. Drew shook my hand again. If you're ever at Dam Neck or Oceana, look me up. That beer offer still stands. I'll keep that in mind. I drove home through empty streets, windows down, letting the October air clear my head. My phone buzzed at a red light. Text from my father. Jessica told me you were at the party tonight. Glad you're spending time with family. We should talk soon. I deleted it without responding. When I got home, there was an envelope in my mailbox. Heavy paper, my father's handwriting on the front. No return address, which meant he'd either dropped it off himself or paid someone to deliver it. I carried it inside and set it on my kitchen counter, unopened. It sat there for 3 days. Every morning I'd see it while making coffee, and every morning I'd leave it sealed. Whatever he'd written, I wasn't ready to read it. Maybe I'd never be ready. On the 4th day, Colonel Monroe stopped me after a staff meeting. Your father's been calling the base. I closed my eyes briefly. Ma'am, I apologize, don't. I told him to stop or I'd have him flagged for harassment. Just giving you a heads up that he's escalating. Understood, ma'am. Thank you. That evening, I finally opened the envelope. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten. My father's careful script, the penmanship he used for important documents and client correspondence. He started with an apology, a real one or close to it. Acknowledged that he dismissed my service. Admitted that Drew's revelation had forced him to confront things he'd been avoiding. Then it shifted into explanation. How hard it had been when I chose military over business. How scared he'd been every time I deployed. How he'd used humor to cope with fear, and somewhere along the way the humor had turned cruel. The last paragraph, I'm proud of you, Brenda. I should have said that years ago. I should have asked what you did instead of assuming. I should have been a better father. I don't know if we can fix this, but I'd like to try. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. Pride. Finally. But it had required a Navy SEAL to tell him I was worth being proud of. It had required public embarrassment and weeks of silence. It had required Jessica playing intermediary and Drew refusing to be his messenger and Colonel Monroe threatening him. It had required everything except what should have been enough from the beginning: me, his daughter, doing work that mattered. I didn't throw the letter away. I put it in my desk drawer under some old tax documents and forgotten birthday cards. Maybe someday I'd respond. Maybe someday the pride he'd finally found would be worth acknowledging. But not today. Today I had lesson plans to review and junior officers to train and a program to build that would save lives I'd never meet. I had work that mattered, work that didn't require anyone's validation to be meaningful. I had chosen this life. And I was good at it. That was enough. November arrived with unseasonably cold weather and the annual Veterans Day ceremony. Maxwell hosted a large event every year, formal, well-attended, the kind of thing where generals gave speeches and the local media showed up to film B-roll for the evening news. I usually avoided these ceremonies. Preferred to spend Veterans Day quietly, maybe calling some of the people I'd served with, checking in on the ones I knew struggled with this particular holiday. But this year I'd been asked to speak. Not as a keynote. That honor went to a retired 4-star general who'd commanded forces in Desert Storm. I was on the program as a voice of the current generation, which meant I had 10 minutes to say something meaningful about service, without being political or controversial or too real. I'd written the speech 3 times. The first version was too angry. The second was too detached. The third struck something close to honest without being bitter. The morning of the ceremony, I put on my dress blues with the same precision I always did. Every ribbon aligned, every crease perfect, shoes polished to a mirror shine. The Bronze Star sat in its proper place. Below it, the Air Force Commendation Medal, the Afghanistan Campaign Medal, the others I'd accumulated over 12 years of service. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw Captain Brenda Owens, now Major Brenda Owens, United States Air Force. 34 years old. Seasoned by combat and responsibility and impossible choices. Carrying herself like she knew exactly who she was. My father used to say I looked uncomfortable in uniform. Like I was playing dress up. Standing there now, I realized he'd been wrong. I looked like myself. Everything else was the costume. The ceremony was held in a hangar converted for the occasion. Rows of folding chairs, a stage with proper lighting, more flags than strictly necessary arranged in formation behind the podium. I arrived early and found my seat in the second row, next to Colonel Monroe and some other field-grade officers. The hangar filled slowly. Active duty personnel in uniform, veterans in everything from full dress to old unit t-shirts, families and civilians who'd come to pay respects. I scanned the crowd out of habit, looking for threats that wouldn't exist here, and then I saw him. My father. Standing near the back, wearing a suit, looking distinctly uncomfortable among all the uniforms. He saw me see him. Raised his hand slightly in acknowledgement. I nodded once and looked away. He came, Colonel Monroe said quietly beside me. Apparently. You okay? Yes, ma'am. The ceremony started at exactly 10:00 hours. National anthem, invocation, opening remarks from the base commander. Then the keynote speaker, who gave a predictably stirring speech about sacrifice and duty. It was good. Well delivered. The kind of speech that made people remember why they'd served or why they were grateful to those who had. Then my name was called. I walked to the podium with measured steps, my heels clicking against the concrete floor. Stood behind the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces. Found Drew and Jessica sitting together about halfway back. Found Lieutenant Nguyen with some other junior officers. Found Colonel Monroe watching me with that expression that meant, don't screw this up. Found my father, still standing near the back, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Good morning, I started. My voice came through the sound system clear and steady. My name is Major Brenda Owens. I've been serving in the United States Air Force for 12 years, and I'm honored to speak with you today about what service means. I didn't read from notes. I'd memorized the speech, but more than that, I'd lived it. When people thank me for my service, I usually don't know what to say. You're welcome feels presumptuous, like I did them a personal favor. It was my honor, sounds rehearsed. So usually I just say thank you back, because the truth is more complicated than gratitude allows. People shifted in their seats, paying attention now. The truth is that I didn't serve for strangers' appreciation. I served because I believed the work mattered. Because coordinating air support for troops under fire meant someone's son or daughter came home alive. Because training junior officers meant fewer mistakes in the field. Because service isn't about glory or recognition, it's about showing up every day and doing work that needs doing. I paused, letting that settle. Some of you here today have served. You know what I'm talking about. The long hours and the impossible decisions and the weight of knowing that your actions have consequences measured in lives. You know what it means to keep going when you're exhausted, scared, and wondering if anyone outside the military even understands what you're doing or why it matters. I could see heads nodding. Veterans recognizing their own experience. And some of you here today love someone who serves. You're the families who wait, who move every few years, who handle the home front alone during deployments. You know a different kind of service, the kind that doesn't wear a uniform but carries just as much weight. Jessica was crying. I hadn't intended that, but I kept going. What I want you to understand is this: service isn't heroic. It's just necessary. Someone has to stand post at 0300 hours. Someone has to make the hard calls. Someone has to train the next generation. We do it because it needs doing, and because we believe the work has meaning even when no one's watching. I found my father's face in the crowd. He was very still. Respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn through consistency and competence and showing up when it matters. It's something you give to others who do the same, regardless of whether they wear a uniform or not. The best thing you can do for veterans isn't thank us. It's understand that we're just people who chose work that mattered, and then trust us to know what that work entailed. I wrapped up with the standard closing about honoring service members past and present, then stepped away from the podium. The applause was polite, appropriate. Not the standing ovation the keynote speaker had received, but I hadn't been going for applause. After the ceremony ended, people approached me. Veterans wanting to share their stories. Families thanking me. Junior officers asking questions about deployments. I handled each conversation with patience, present for each person even as I tracked my father's position in my peripheral vision. He waited until the crowd thinned, then approached carefully. Like he wasn't sure if I'd talk to him. Brenda. Dad. We stood facing each other, both of us uncertain. He looked older than I remembered. More gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes. Carrying his own weight. That was a good speech, he said finally. Thank you. I got your letter. The one you didn't send. Jessica told me you kept it. I stayed silent. I know I don't deserve another chance, he continued. I know I spent years not seeing you. Not seeing what you were doing or why it mattered. Drew made that pretty clear. This isn't about Drew. No. It's about me being a terrible father who was too proud to admit his daughter was better than him. That surprised me. My father didn't admit weakness easily. I'm not better than you, Dad. I'm just different. I chose different work. Work you never tried to understand. I was scared, he said quietly. Every time you deployed, I was terrified I'd get a phone call that you were dead. So I pretended it wasn't dangerous. Pretended you were sitting in air-conditioned offices pushing papers. Because if I acknowledged what you actually did, I'd have to acknowledge I might lose you. 12 years. 12 years of service, and he'd never said that. You did lose me, I said. Just not the way you were afraid of. He nodded slowly. I know. I don't know if we can fix this. Neither do I. But I'd like to try. Colonel Monroe appeared beside us, perfectly timed as always. Major Owens, the base commander would like a word when you have a moment. I nodded gratefully. Looked back at my father. I have to go. Can I call you? Actually call you and have you answer. I considered it. Weighed 12 years of dismissal against one letter and one appearance at a ceremony. Weighed anger against the possibility that people could change, even slowly. Yes, I said finally. You can call. Thank you. I walked away with Colonel Monroe, leaving my father standing in the emptying hangar. That looked difficult, she said. It was. You handled it well. I don't know yet, ma'am. Ask me in 6 months. She smiled slightly. Fair enough. The call came 3 days later. Wednesday evening, right around 1800 hours when I was making dinner, chicken and vegetables, the kind of simple meal that required minimal attention, but felt like self-care anyway. My phone buzzed with my father's name on the screen. I almost didn't answer. Old habits, old protection. But I'd told him he could call, so I dried my hands and picked up. "Hey, Dad." "Brenda. Thanks for answering." He sounded nervous, which was unusual. My father was many things, but nervous wasn't typically one of them. "Is this a bad time?" "I'm making dinner. I can talk." "How's the new rank treating you?" Small talk. We'd never been good at it, but at least he was trying. "It's fine. More meetings, more administrative work. Still teaching." "Jessica mentioned you're building a new training program." So he'd been asking about me. Through Jessica, naturally. Baby steps. "Yeah. Comprehensive air-ground coordination curriculum. It'll prepare junior officers for joint operations." "That sounds important." "It is." Silence stretched between us, not quite comfortable but not hostile either. The sound of him trying to figure out what to say, me trying to figure out if I wanted to help him or make him work for it. "I've been thinking about what you said," he started carefully. "About me not wanting to know." "You were right. I didn't want to know. Still don't, in some ways. But I'm trying to understand that my comfort doesn't matter as much as respecting what you do." It wasn't poetry, but it was honest. More honest than he'd been in years. "I appreciate that. Can I ask you something? And if you don't want to answer, that's fine. Go ahead. That night in Helmand, when you saved Drew's team, were you scared?" The question surprised me. He never asked about my emotional state during missions. Never acknowledged that there might be fear underneath the confidence. I thought about lying. Thought about giving him the sanitized version where I was calm and professional and completely in control. But he was trying, so I gave him the truth instead. Terrified, I said. I had 3 teams calling for help, 1 helicopter, and no good options. Every choice meant someone would die or be permanently damaged. And I had to make that choice anyway, then live with it. How do you do that? Live with it. You focus on the ones you saved instead of the ones you couldn't. You trust that you made the best decision with the information you had. And you keep going because stopping means someone else has to make those choices, and they might not be ready. He was quiet for a long moment. I don't think I could do that. Most people couldn't. That's why it's a specific job that requires specific training. I'm proud of you. There it was. The thing I'd wanted to hear for 12 years, offered now in a quiet phone call while I stood in my kitchen stirring vegetables. It should have felt bigger. Should have filled some empty space I'd been carrying. Instead, it just felt sad. Sad that it had taken so long. Sad that it had required Drew's intervention. Sad that pride had to be learned instead of given freely. "Thank you," I said, because that's what you say when your father tells you he's proud. I mean it. I know it's late. I know I should have said it years ago. But I mean it now. I know you do. We talked for another 20 minutes. Surface-level stuff mostly. His work, my work, Jessica and Drew's plans to buy a house. Testing the waters of what normal conversation might look like between us. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't painful either. Just 2 people trying to figure out how to be family when family had been fractured for so long. When we hung up, I finished making dinner and ate alone at my small kitchen table. The conversation played through my head, looking for trapdoors and hidden meanings. Old survival instincts from a childhood spent learning to read my father's moods. But maybe there were no trapdoors this time. Maybe he was just a man who'd realized too late that he'd failed his daughter, and he was trying to make it right in the only way he knew how. I could accept that. Could let him try. Didn't mean I'd forget the years of dismissal or the casual cruelty of that wedding reception. Didn't mean trust would rebuild overnight. But it meant I'd answer the phone. Meant I'd let him be part of my life in whatever limited capacity felt safe. That was enough for now. Lieutenant Gwynn caught me after class the next day. She'd been doing better in the simulations, still struggled with prioritization under pressure, but she was learning to make decisions instead of freezing. "Major Owens? I saw your speech at the Veterans Day ceremony. On the base website." "Oh, good. It helped. The part about service being necessary instead of heroic. I've been so worried about being brave enough, and you reframed the whole thing." I smiled despite myself. Being brave is overrated. Being competent is what matters. That's what I mean. You make it feel achievable instead of impossible. She left, and I stood there thinking about what she'd said. About reframing. About making the impossible feel achievable. About how teaching might be the most important work I'd ever done, even if it would never earn medals or recognition. Drew sent me an email that afternoon. Heard you killed it at the ceremony. Jessica said your father showed up. Hope that went okay. Standing offer for beer still stands. Drew, I wrote back, thanks. It went as well as it could have. Appreciate the support. Brenda, professional. Cordial. The kind of relationship you built with people who'd seen you at your worst and still respected you. My father called again on Sunday. Then again the following Wednesday. A pattern establishing itself. We didn't talk about anything earth-shattering, just life, work, small updates. He asked questions about my job and actually listened to the answers. Shared things about his own work without making it a competition. Slowly, carefully, we built something that resembled a functional father-daughter relationship. It would never be what it could have been if he'd respected my service from the beginning. Too much time had passed, too much damage had been done. But it was something. And maybe something was enough. I stood in the conference room at Maxwell, watching Lieutenant Nguyen brief a room full of senior officers on her capstone project. She'd come so far from the nervous second lieutenant who couldn't prioritize under pressure. Now she was calm, articulate, fielding questions from colonels with the kind of confidence that came from actual competence rather than bravado. When she finished, I caught her eye and nodded once. She smiled, relief and pride mixing on her face. A year had passed since the wedding reception. A year since my father's public humiliation and Drew's revelation. A year of slow, careful rebuilding and learning to live with relationships that were good enough instead of perfect. My father and I talked most weeks now. Not long conversations, usually 20 minutes, sometimes less. He'd ask about my training program, and I'd tell him. He'd share updates about his consulting work, and I'd listen. We were learning each other again, or maybe learning each other for the first time. He'd never apologize perfectly. I'd never forget completely. But we'd found a rhythm that worked. He'd asked to visit last month. Wanted to see where I worked, meet Colonel Monroe, understand what my life actually looked like. I'd said yes, and he'd flown down for a weekend. I'd shown him around the base, introduced him to my fellow instructors, let him sit in on one of my classes. Watching him watch me teach had been strange, seeing him see me as the professional I'd always been, but he'd never acknowledged. You're good at this, he'd said afterward, sounding surprised. I know, I'd replied. Not defensive, just factual. Drew and Jessica had their first baby in March. A daughter they named Emma. I'd visited them in Virginia Beach, held the tiny human who had Drew's eyes and Jessica's smile, and felt something unexpected, the sense of family expanding instead of fracturing. Drew and I had fallen into an easy friendship built on mutual respect and shared understanding. We didn't talk about Hellman much. Didn't need to. The knowledge of what had happened that night existed between us like bedrock, solid and unspoken. You're good with her, Jessica had said, watching me hold Emma. You should think about having kids. Maybe someday, I'd replied, non-committal. The truth was I couldn't imagine it yet. My life was full, demanding job, fulfilling work, a version of peace I'd fought hard to find. Adding children felt like something for a different version of myself, one I might grow into eventually, but wasn't ready for now. My training program had launched officially in June. Comprehensive air-ground coordination curriculum, designed to prepare junior officers for the reality of combat operations. The feedback had been overwhelmingly positive. Other bases were asking for the materials. The Air Force had started talking about making it standard across all officer training programs. Colonel Monroe had pulled me aside last week. You're being looked at for lieutenant colonel. Probably 2 years out, but you're on the list. Oh, 5. The rank where you moved from tactical leadership to strategic planning. Where your decisions shaped policy instead of just executing it. I was 35. Most people made lieutenant colonel around 39-40. Being on the early promotion track meant someone thought I had potential beyond my current role. Thank you for the heads up, ma'am. Don't thank me. Just keep doing what you're doing. Now I gathered my materials from the conference room, nodding to Gwyn as she collected her own things. Good work today, Lieutenant. Thank you, ma'am. I couldn't have done it without your program. You did it with the skills you developed. I just provided the framework. She left, and I stood alone in the empty conference room, looking out the window at the flight line. Jets taking off in the distance, the sound muted by thick glass. Somewhere out there, people were deploying, running missions, making impossible decisions under pressure, living the life I'd lived, carrying weight I understood. And here I was, training the next generation to do it better, to make fewer mistakes, to come home with fewer scars. My phone buzzed. Text from my father. Dinner this weekend? I'm in Montgomery for work. A year ago, I wouldn't have answered. 6 months ago, I would have hesitated. Now I typed back, sure. Saturday at 1800 hours. Perfect. I'll make reservations. I pocketed my phone and headed back to my office. There was paperwork to finish, lesson plans to review, emails to answer. The unglamorous work that kept the military running. The work that mattered even when no one was watching. Lieutenant Commander Drew Mason had said something at Veterans Day that stuck with me. Training the next generation to not make the mistakes we made, that's how we actually get better at this. He'd been right. This was how progress happened. Not through individual heroics or dramatic moments, but through steady, patient work. Through showing up every day and doing the job well. Through passing on hard-won knowledge so the next person didn't have to learn it the same painful way. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago. Sitting at that wedding reception, absorbing my father's mockery with practiced stillness. Carrying years of accumulated dismissal like weight in my chest. Waiting for validation that never came freely. That woman was gone. Or rather, she'd evolved into someone who didn't need external validation anymore. Who knew her worth independent of anyone else's recognition. Who could accept her father's belated pride without letting it fill spaces that had learned to exist without it. Respect wasn't given because of blood. It was earned and kept by how you carried yourself when no one else was watching. I'd earned it. From Drew and his team. From Colonel Monroe and Lieutenant Gwyn and countless others I'd trained and guided. From myself, which was the only validation that had ever really mattered. My father's pride was a bonus. Welcome, but not necessary. Not anymore. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and got back to work. There were junior officers to train, missions to prepare them for, lives to save through better preparation. The work was endless and essential and exactly where I needed to be. Outside my window, another jet lifted off the runway, banking gracefully into the Alabama sky. Rising toward whatever mission waited, whatever challenges lay ahead. I watched it climb until it disappeared into the clouds, then turned back to my computer and kept working. Thanks for watching. If this resonated, tap like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a boundary win today. Questions for you. Has a family member ever minimized your work or service in public? What did you do? Who surprised you by stepping up when you most needed it? What boundary have you set that changed a relationship, for better or worse? If you're a veteran or first responder, how do you want loved ones to talk about your service? If you were in that reception hall, what would you have said to my father? Drop your story in the comments. Someone here needs to hear it.